going into a situation deliberately having a different style of, rather than complaining about the past, talking about the future, and being evangelical about that in an organisation. And in a period of time, the organisation, the whole culture of the organisation has changed because just using different language about from day to day.
Yeah. If we're able to influence, or if we're able to perturb part of the organisation as a system, which really consists of people interacting with each other, perturb them so there's shifts in their way of being and they begin to interact differently and have different conversations, that's where change sits, because it's people that implement the change through conversations.
And the role of the leader is to perturb, have the right perturbance, initiate the right and maintain that right perturbance.
And so coming back to here, this point, perturb, all we can do in coaching is perturb the nervous system of the coachee. We cannot directly instruct or directly influence. And the challenge of coaching is to be skillful in the judgments and intuition about how we seek to perturb for the benefit of the coachee.
Isn't it possible to argue a step further, and this is where we come back to the more biological or neurosciences, to say that, and that's why it works, because by perturbing them, their brain connectivity changes, and they have a different way of being.
Yeah.
And so it is, you can have a scientific underpinning to, that's why coaching works.
Yeah.
Because it changes your brain.
And there is some research out of psychotherapy. I forget the guy's name, he's from Pepperdine, but it's very consistent with what Maturana is saying, that he's actually come through this, he's pulled together stuff from different aspects of science. But it's interesting because the whole notion of perturbing is a very different way of looking at influence and leadership, parenting and teaching and so on. And Maturana's coined the term the myth of instructive interaction. If I tell you what to do, you will now perfectly understand it the way I want you to. Because the only place I can communicate to is the structure of your nervous system. But who knows what's happening there, what perturbing has happened, if it's the way I want it to be.
So what does that mean in terms of transferring knowledge? Well,
there's no sort of transfer of, A to B, like that's an engineering, yeah. Basically it's about how do we engage in people in interaction in a way that perturbs them and has the material become accessible to them we would like them to learn, and facilitate them stepping into that to learn, and to learn through experience. So there's a whole lot of things involved in that. But our whole tradition, I think, is what's called an instructive approach, and what we can take from what Maturana says, it's a dynamic, interactive approach. That's how learning happens.
But don't you think that, or I'll put forward the hypothesis that the notion of knowledge transfer in the teacher concept comes from our experience with environments in which we were so closely associated with other people that we got into that cycle that you were talking about earlier of the recurrent interaction and mutual perturbation. So we had people in such close proximity and in such repetitive relationships that it looked like we were instructing, when in fact, because of the closeness of those relationships, we were really getting the mutual perturbation.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Like, how does the young girl learn to sew or dress?
Right.
Well, she's with her mother and her aunties or her older sisters, and there's this conversation and interaction, and she learns these distinctions and she applies them. How does the young boy learn to become the blacksmith? So it's the apprenticeship.
So it actually worked.
Yeah.
And the idea arose in environments that were relatively static compared to the environments that we're in now. And the notion breaks down when the distance between individuals becomes greater and the rate of environmental change becomes greater. because then I don't get into the recurrent interaction,
Mm.
and so don't get the mutual perturbation.
Yeah,
But how's that gonna change with things like Twitter, Twitter, Facebook, where we have opportunity for conversation, bombarding us with conversation? How's that gonna increase or
Raises
speed
a
up?
whole lot of issues, yeah.
Yeah.
I won't sort of open that up now if you don't mind, but what you're pointing to is important implications about
Where it's
what-
come from, where it's going.
how do we influence change? How do we influence change? How do we facilitate learning?
Just a further observation, I think in the context of an organisation, in my current personal experience, we're moving from a very small organisation where decision makers and risk management is all done in a very informal way, but properly, to a huge organisation. And in the past, someone would say, oh, is it all right for me to do this? And the decision maker who's looking over your shoulder and has got skin in the game and is experienced and everything can say, ask you one or two questions and say, yeah, this is okay. Now, we have to go to 6 different people, email them, and they ask questions back, because that distance, that intimacy, and they think out that they can't understand how we were in control before. And now we have a very much instructional process,
Yeah.
rather than more connected approaches.
So people will be being perturbed
Huge
in that context,
yeah,
but perhaps not in the way that's ultimately assessed to be beneficial.
And even though we can see that it's the right way to do it in the large organisation, it's hugely perturbing to transform from one style to another.
Yeah. Okay, just the other thing I'll mention here is around creativity and change. He says that creativity is when one observer makes what he calls a novel distinction. They're able to distinguish some part of the world that previously others couldn't observe. And one of the risks there is that people who make novel distinctions can become heretics. They stand outside the conventional accepted way of observing and participating in the world.
And this can be a barrier for learning.
Yes. Yeah.
If you realise that there's something different about the world and you want to explore it, but it's outside the accepted norms of your social group or your peers, then you may feel nervous about learning.
Yeah.
Because you don't want to be branded a heretic.
Well, you risk social alienation, which threatens then what I believe is a core human concern, belonging, because we're the social nature of that man.
So, Alan, for me, the place that I am looking for the connection is, if we look at the conversation that we had yesterday around energetic systems and chakras,
Yep.
okay, and then we bring that into this concept of nervous system.
Yeah.
In a traditional Western science way of looking at it, we don't have a way to connect those notions.
Of chakras and Maturanas?
Chakras and nervous systems.
Oh, okay. Like you say in a rigorous scientific sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's the bridge that I'm looking for.
Okay.
Because as I look at this notion of structurally determined, okay, there's one kind of structural determination which is inside of a biologic entity, me, a person, but there's another kind of something structurally determined, which is the nervous system of the family system, right? So it's getting back to that Mona Lisa Schultz notion of that there's a nutrient or there's a connection, there's a something that's actually existing between human beings in a group.
Yeah.
Now, in the what you just shared with us, it sounded like the hypothesis is that consists only of language. But if we go back to Mona Lisa Schultz and we go back to some of the concept of chakra, there's the maybe hint. I wouldn't say as much as implication, although in Mona Lisa Schultz I would say implication.
Yeah.
The hint that there's something other than language.